The bell above Bob's Diner's door chimed softly at exactly 7:30 a.m., just as it had every Sunday morning for the past 23 years. Harold Mitchell, age 93, stepped inside with measured steps, his weathered hands gripping a polished wooden cane. The morning sunlight streaming through the large windows caught the gleam of his military pins, carefully arranged on his neat brown jacket. "Morning, Harold." Susan, the longtime waitress, called out with genuine warmth. She was already moving towards the coffee pot, knowing his order by heart. The other regulars nodded respectfully as the elderly veteran made his way to his corner booth, the one with the best view of both the street and the framed black and white photographs that lined the diner's walls. Harold's ritual never changed. First, he would carefully fold his morning newspaper and place it on the left side of the table. Then he would remove his reading glasses from their worn leather case, setting them next to the paper. His movements were deliberate, each action refined by thousands of repetitions. Susan approached with his coffee, steam rising from the white ceramic mug. "Black, just how you like it," she said, placing it exactly 3 inches from his right hand. Harold's blue eyes crinkled with a smile. He had been coming here so long that the staff knew to leave extra space between the coffee and the table's edge. His hands weren't as steady as they used to be. "Thank you, dear," he replied, his voice carrying the gentle raspiness of age, but still maintaining the clear authority of a man who had once commanded troops. As Susan walked away, Harold's eyes drifted to the empty seat across from him. That had been Grace's spot for 18 years until cancer took her in 2019. You could still see her there sometimes, stirring sugar into her tea and telling him not to read the newspaper before talking to her. The diner buzzed with its usual Sunday morning energy. Families gathered for after-church breakfast, couples leaned close over shared plates of pancakes, and solo diners tapped away at their phones. But Harold's corner remained a peaceful island of old-world dignity. He unfolded his newspaper with careful precision, smoothing out the creases before beginning his methodical read-through. Other customers often wondered about the quiet veteran in the corner booth. They noticed how he would pause sometimes, staring out the window with eyes that seemed to see something far beyond Main Street. They noticed the military bearing that age hadn't erased from his shoulders, and how he would tap his fingers against his coffee mug in what some recognized as Morse code, an old habit from his Navy days. What they didn't know was that Harold Mitchell had been part of the D-Day invasion, that he had helped liberate small French villages, or that he still carried shrapnel in his left leg from the Battle of the Bulge. They didn't know about the medals carefully stored in a box under his bed, or the letters he still wrote every month to the families of his fallen comrades. The regulars had learned to watch for his small daily gestures, how he would always leave an extra $1 for Susan, folded into a neat triangle, how he would lift his coffee cup to the empty seat across from him before taking his first sip, how he would help young mothers manage their strollers through the door despite his own limited mobility. This Sunday started like any other. Harold worked his way through the newspaper, section by section, pausing occasionally to sip his coffee or make a quiet comment to Susan when she came to refill his cup. He saved the crossword puzzle for last. That had been his and Grace's tradition. They would compete to see who could solve more clues, though he had always suspected she let him win more often than not. The morning light grew stronger, warming the worn leather of the booth and making the silver of Harold's hair shine. He was more than just a customer here. He was part of the diner's soul, a living connection to a generation that was slowly fading away. Young servers learned to slow down when passing his table, often pausing to hear stories about a world they knew only from history books. None of the breakfast crowd that peaceful Sunday morning could have guessed that this familiar scene, the old veteran with his coffee and newspaper, the comfortable routine of a quiet morning, was about to be shattered. Change was roaring down the highway on motorcycles, headed straight for Bob's Diner, about to test whether a 93-year-old's dignity could stand against leather-clad intimidation. But for now, Harold Mitchell sat in his corner booth, sipping his coffee, watching the world go by through the window, completely unaware that his next Sunday morning would be very different indeed. The following Sunday started differently. Before Harold Mitchell could reach his usual corner booth at Bob's Diner, the roar of motorcycle engines shattered the morning peace. The sound made the windows rattle, causing several customers to look up from their breakfast plates with startled expressions. 6 large motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their chrome parts gleaming in the morning sun. The riders, dressed in black leather jackets with Road Raiders emblazoned across their backs, dismounted with an air of ownership. They were all tall, muscular men, covered in tattoos, and wearing heavy boots that thudded against the diner's linoleum floor as they entered. Harold stood near the entrance, his hand gripping his cane a little tighter. The bikers brushed past him without a glance, making their way straight to his corner booth. Their leader, a man with a thick beard and dark sunglasses, sprawled across the seat where Grace used to sit. The other five crowded around, their leather jackets creaking as they settled in. Susan, the waitress, shot Harold an apologetic look. She had never seen these men before, and something about their presence made her nervous. The other customers began to whisper among themselves, throwing uncertain glances toward the corner that had always been Harold's quiet sanctuary. "Guess I'll sit somewhere else today," Harold said quietly, moving toward a small table near the kitchen. His newspaper was folded neatly under his arm, his dignity intact despite the obvious intrusion. But everyone who knew him could see the slight tremor in his hands as he arranged his reading glasses on the unfamiliar table. The bikers ordered their breakfast loudly, their voices carrying across the diner. They laughed roughly at their own jokes, occasionally dropping curse words that made parents cover their children's ears. The peaceful Sunday atmosphere had vanished, replaced by a tension that hung heavy in the air. Week after week, the scene repeated itself. The road raiders would arrive just before Harold, claiming his booth and transforming the friendly diner into their personal territory. Regular customers began to drift away, uncomfortable with the new atmosphere. Families with children stopped coming altogether, and the Sunday morning crowd grew smaller and smaller. Harold, however, refused to change his routine. He continued to arrive at 7:30 a.m. sharp, taking whatever table was available. Sometimes he sat at the counter, his back straight despite his age, sipping his coffee with the same quiet dignity he had shown for the past 2 decades. The bikers noticed his persistence. At first, they ignored him, but as the weeks passed, their attitude changed. They began to make comments just loud enough for him to hear. "Look at the old-timer," one would say, "still fighting World War II in his head." "Those pins on his jacket probably came from a costume shop," another would snicker. Susan tried to intervene once, telling them about Harold's service record, but they just laughed it off. "Ancient history," their leader said, dismissing decades of sacrifice with 2 words. The harassment grew more direct. They would bump his table while walking past, causing his coffee to spill. They mimicked his careful way of walking, exaggerating his dependence on his cane. Once, they even took his newspaper before he could reach it, using it as a placemat for their plates. Other customers watched these scenes with a mixture of anger and helplessness. Mr. Peterson, the hardware store owner, offered to call the police, but Harold always shook his head. "No need for that," he would say, though his voice carried a weight it hadn't before. The diner's owner, Bob Wilson, felt trapped. The bikers were paying customers, and technically, they hadn't broken any rules. They were just being unpleasant, which wasn't illegal. Still, it hurt him to see Harold, one of his oldest and most respected customers, treated this way. As the situation continued, something changed in Harold's eyes. The usual warmth was still there, but now it was accompanied by something else. A calculating look that those who had served with him would have recognized. It was the same expression he had worn while planning military strategies, the look of a man who had faced worse odds and prevailed. The road raiders didn't notice this change. They were too busy enjoying their perceived victory over the old veteran, too caught up in their own show of power to realize that Harold Mitchell hadn't survived 93 years and a world war by backing down from bullies. What they didn't know was that Harold had already spotted something interesting about their leader, something that would soon change everything. But for now, he simply sat at his small table, watching and waiting, while his coffee grew cold in its cup. 3 weeks into the road raiders' takeover of Bob's Diner, Harold Mitchell's patience was being tested like never before. Even during the worst battles of World War II, he had maintained his composure, but watching these bikers disrespect not just him, but the entire diner community, made his blood pressure rise in a way his doctor wouldn't approve of. That particular Sunday started with an even more aggressive display than usual. The bikers had arrived early, parking their motorcycles in a way that blocked most of the entrance. Harold had to carefully maneuver around them, his cane sliding slightly on the morning dew-covered pavement. As he reached for the door handle, the rumble of another motorcycle made him pause. "Well, if it isn't Private Fossil," called out Mike, the gang's leader, as he dismounted his bike. The other raiders, already inside, laughed loudly through the windows. Harold said nothing, holding the door open as Mike swaggered past him. The veteran's face remained neutral, but his grip on his cane tightened until his knuckles turned white. Inside, the harassment continued. The bikers had spread themselves out across several booths, leaving only the wobbly table near the kitchen available. Harold made his way there, carefully placing his newspaper down, when one of the raiders deliberately bumped into him. The impact wasn't hard, but for a 93-year-old man, it was enough to make him stumble. Susan rushed forward to help, but Harold waved her off. "I'm fine, dear," he said, his voice steady despite the situation. "I've had worse in Normandy." This comment triggered another round of mocking from the bikers. "Hey, Grandpa," one called out, "did you fight dinosaurs in Normandy too?" More laughter followed. As Harold settled into his chair, he noticed something different about the raiders today. They seemed more agitated than usual, their voices louder, their movements more aggressive. Empty beer bottles peeked out of their motorcycle saddlebags. They clearly started their day early. The morning progressed with increasing tension. Every time Susan brought Harold his coffee refill, one of the raiders would find a way to interrupt, either by calling for service or deliberately blocking her path. By his third attempt at enjoying his coffee, Harold had more of it on his newspaper than in his cup. The other customers watched the scene with growing discomfort. A young family quickly finished their breakfast and hurried out, the mother shooting an apologetic look at Harold. An elderly couple who usually sat near him had stopped coming altogether. Bob's Diner, once a peaceful haven of community gathering, had become a place of tension and fear. Harold observed it all with military precision. He noticed how the raiders' leader, Mike, would occasionally touch a spot on his left forearm, just below his leather jacket's sleeve. He saw how the youngest member of the gang would flinch slightly whenever plates clattered too loudly in the kitchen. Most importantly, he noticed the military boot prints left in the parking lot's dust, prints he recognized from standard-issue combat boots. The situation reached its peak when one of the raiders, a particularly large man with a snake tattoo on his neck, decided to take Harold's newspaper. "Let's see what's so interesting in here, old-timer," he sneered, snatching it from Harold's table. As he did so, he knocked over Harold's coffee cup, sending the hot liquid cascading into the veteran's lap. The diner fell silent. Even the raiders seemed to sense they'd crossed a line. Harold slowly stood up, his movements deliberate and controlled. Despite his age, despite his cane, despite everything, there was something in his bearing that made everyone pause. For a moment, they didn't see a 93-year-old man, but a soldier who had faced down Nazi tanks. "Young man," Harold said, his voice carrying the command of decades of military service, "you just made a serious tactical error." The biker with the snake tattoo blinked, suddenly uncertain. Mike, the gang's leader, leaned forward in his booth, his sunglasses slipping slightly to reveal alert, watchful eyes. Harold reached into his jacket pocket, not for a weapon or his phone, but for something that would change the entire dynamic of Bob's Diner. He had recognized the signs, understood the patterns, and now it was time to implement the strategy he'd been planning since the raiders first arrived. The moment had come for Harold Mitchell to show these young men that age and wisdom could triumph over intimidation and force. The swift decision he was about to make would not only restore peace to his beloved diner, but would also change the lives of everyone involved in ways none of them could imagine. During the tense standoff at Bob's Diner, Susan Miller wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward. She had worked at the diner for 15 years, and in all that time, she had never told anyone the full story about Harold Mitchell. But now, watching the veteran face down these troublemakers, she knew it was time to share what she knew. "Before you boys do anything else," Susan said, her voice carrying across the silent diner, "you might want to know who you're dealing with." She moved to stand beside Harold, her presence providing quiet support to the elderly veteran. The road raiders turned their attention to her, curiosity momentarily replacing their hostility. Mike, their leader, kept his sunglasses fixed on Harold, but tilted his head slightly toward Susan, indicating he was listening. "That man you've been harassing," Susan continued, pointing to Harold. "He wasn't just any soldier. He was part of a special military unit that specialized in conflict resolution after World War II. She pulled out her phone and showed them an old black and white photograph she had kept saved. The photograph showed a younger Harold Mitchell, standing tall in his military uniform, shaking hands with several high-ranking officers. Behind them was a group of former enemy soldiers, all engaged in what appeared to be a peaceful discussion. Harold here was known as the bridge builder, Susan explained, her voice filled with respect. When the fighting ended, they needed someone who could talk to both sides, someone who could help former enemies become allies. That was Harold's job. The raiders looked at the photograph with growing interest. Their tough exterior cracked slightly as they learned about the man they'd been tormenting. Even Mike removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that held a mix of surprise and something else, recognition, perhaps. Susan went on to describe how Harold had worked in devastated European towns, bringing together people who had been trying to kill each other just months before. He had organized joint reconstruction projects, mediated disputes, and helped communities heal from the wounds of war. There was this one time in a small German town, Susan said, recounting a story Harold had told her years ago. Two groups were ready to start fighting again over food distribution. Harold spent 3 days and nights sitting with both sides, listening to their stories, finding common ground. By the end of it, those same people were working together to rebuild their town school. The diner remained silent as Susan shared more details about Harold's service. She told them about the time he prevented a riot by organizing a soccer game between American soldiers and local civilians. She described how he had helped reunite separated families across enemy lines, using his negotiation skills to cut through red tape and bureaucracy. The military gave him medals for his combat service, Susan said, but Harold's proudest achievements were the peaceful solutions he helped create. He didn't just fight in the war, he helped build the peace that came after it. As she spoke, several of the raiders shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The young one who flinched at loud noises was now looking at Harold with something close to admiration. The one with the snake tattoo had put down Harold's newspaper, carefully folding it back up. Even after he came home, Susan continued, Harold kept using those skills. He worked as a mediator in our town for 30 years. He helped settle disputes between neighbors, prevented business partnerships from falling apart, and even saved a few marriages. She smiled at Harold, who was standing quietly, letting his story be told. That corner booth you boys have been sitting in? Susan gestured to their usual spot. Harold and his wife Grace used it as an unofficial meeting place. People would come to them with their problems, and they'd leave with solutions. After Grace passed away, Harold kept coming, kept helping anyone who needed it. The atmosphere in the diner had transformed. The tension was still there, but it had changed into something different, a kind of respectful attention. The raiders were seeing Harold in a new light, not as an old man to be pushed around, but as someone who had faced challenges they could barely imagine and emerged with wisdom rather than bitterness. Susan finished her story and stepped back, leaving Harold standing alone again. But now he wasn't just a 93-year-old veteran being bullied by bikers. He was the bridge builder, a man who had spent his life turning enemies into friends, chaos into peace. The decision Harold was about to make would draw upon all of those skills, all of that experience. As he looked at the road raiders, he saw something in them that reminded him of other troubled young men he had helped long ago, in cities and towns far from here. Harold Mitchell's trained eyes hadn't missed a single detail about the road raiders over the past few weeks. While others saw only intimidating bikers, he had noticed the subtle signs that told a different story. Today, as he stood in the tense atmosphere of Bob's diner, those observations were about to prove crucial. During one of their earlier confrontations, Mike, the raiders' leader, had reached up to wipe sweat from his face, causing his leather jacket sleeve to slide back slightly. In that brief moment, Harold had caught a glimpse of a distinctive tattoo, the emblem of the 75th Ranger Regiment. It wasn't the kind of tattoo someone could buy in a local parlor. It was earned through service and sacrifice. Harold had also noticed other telling signs among the group. The youngest raider's reaction to sudden noises wasn't just nervousness. It was the ingrained response of someone who had spent time in combat zones. The way they positioned themselves in the diner, always facing the doors and windows, spoke of military training. Even their motorcycles were arranged in a defensive formation in the parking lot. These weren't ordinary troublemakers. They were veterans, just like him, but veterans carrying different wounds from a different war. As Harold watched Mike now, he saw the leader's hand unconsciously move to his left side whenever a car backfired outside, likely covering an old injury. The gesture reminded Harold of his own habit of rubbing his leg where the shrapnel still rested. a souvenir from the Battle of the Bulge. The other raiders showed similar signs. One constantly scanned the diner's ceiling, a habit Harold recognized from soldiers who had served in urban combat zones. Another kept checking his watch every few minutes, matching the timing of patrol rotations. These weren't random behaviors, they were the lingering habits of men who had seen too much. Harold's mind drifted back to his own return from war, decades ago. He remembered the anger, the difficulty adjusting to civilian life, the need to maintain the brotherhood formed in combat. Back then, he had been fortunate to have mentors who understood, who helped him channel those feelings into something positive. Looking at the raiders now, Harold saw what others missed, the pain behind their aggressive behavior, the struggle to find their place in a world that didn't understand their experiences. Their leather jackets and loud motorcycles weren't just for show. They were armor against a society that often forgot its warriors once the fighting was done. Mike's sunglasses couldn't hide the subtle tilt of his head whenever Harold spoke, the instinctive response of a soldier recognizing authority. The other raiders, too, showed unconscious military courtesy in their movements, even while trying to appear disrespectful. Harold noticed how they took care of each other. When one raider's hand started shaking while holding his coffee cup, another would smoothly distract attention from it. When the youngest member had his bad moments, the others would close ranks around him, shielding him from curious eyes. It was the same protective instinct Harold had seen countless times during his service. The revelation struck Harold deeply. These men weren't truly targeting him. They were acting out of their own pain, their own struggles to readjust. Their behavior was a cry for help disguised as aggression, a shield against vulnerabilities they couldn't afford to show. As he stood there in Bob's diner, Harold realized why fate had brought them all together. His years of experience in post-war reconciliation hadn't just been about bringing together former enemies. They had been preparation for this moment, for helping these lost warriors find their way back home. The decision forming in Harold's mind wasn't just about reclaiming his corner booth or restoring peace to the diner. It was about reaching across generations. One veteran helping others navigate the challenges he had faced himself. These young men needed more than confrontation. They needed understanding, guidance, and most importantly, someone who could speak their language. Harold's hand moved to his jacket pocket, where he kept something he had carried since 1945, a simple object that had helped him bridge many divides. As he prepared to make his move, he wasn't thinking as a 93-year-old man confronting bullies. He was thinking as a veteran recognizing fellow soldiers in pain, as someone who had learned that the hardest battles often came after the war was over. The patrons of Bob's Diner held their breath, waiting to see what this elderly veteran would do next, unaware that they were about to witness not a confrontation, but a reunion of warriors separated by time, but united by experience. The silence in Bob's Diner felt heavy as Harold Mitchell made his move. Instead of backing away or showing anger, he did something that surprised everyone. He pulled up a chair directly at the raiders' table, positioning himself right next to Mike, their leader. "Mind if I join you, boys?" Harold asked, though he was already settling into the chair. His voice carried the calm authority of someone who had faced far worse situations than this. The raiders exchanged confused looks, temporarily thrown off by this unexpected development. From his jacket pocket, Harold pulled out a small, worn metal object. It was his old military compass, its brass surface dulled by age but still functional. He placed it carefully on the table between himself and Mike. The compass had guided him through the forests of Europe during World War II, and now it would help him navigate this delicate situation. "You know," Harold began, his voice gentle but clear, "when I first got back from Europe in '45, I couldn't sit in a diner either." He tapped the compass lightly. "Had to keep my back to the wall, needed to watch every door, couldn't stand loud noises. Sound familiar to any of you?" Mike's jaw tightened slightly, and the youngest raider stopped pretending to look at his phone. Harold had their attention now, though they tried to hide it behind scowls and crossed arms. "The first time I tried to eat at a restaurant after coming home," Harold continued, "I threw a cup of coffee at a waiter because he came up behind me too quietly." He shook his head at the memory. "Took me months to apologize properly to that poor man." A few of the raiders shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The one with the snake tattoo absently rubbed his arm where Harold knew a unit insignia was hidden under his leather jacket. This compass, Harold picked it up, turning it in his weathered hands, didn't just help me find my way through battlefields. It helped me find my way back home. He held it out to Mike. Take a look. These scratch marks on the back, each one represents a time I almost lost my way after the war, but somehow found my path again. Mike hesitated, then slowly took the compass. As he examined it, his tough facade cracked slightly. Harold noticed his hands. They were steady, trained hands, but they held the compass with the respect of someone who understood its significance. The thing about compasses, Harold said, watching as Mike turned the old instrument over in his hands, is that they don't just point north. They help you figure out where you are, and more importantly, where you're trying to go. He looked around the table, making eye contact with each raider. Sometimes we all need a little help finding our direction again. The diner had grown so quiet that the only sounds were the soft clicking of the kitchen clock and the occasional clink of coffee cups. Other customers watched the scene unfold, amazed at how the morning's tension had transformed into something entirely different. Harold leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a level meant only for the raiders to hear. I recognize the signs, boys. The way you watch the doors, how you position yourselves, the fact that none of you have touched your coffee because you need your hands free. He nodded toward Mike. The way you favor your left side when you think no one's watching, Afghanistan or Iraq. Mike's head snapped up, his sunglasses slipping down to reveal surprised eyes. The other raiders stared at Harold with new recognition, suddenly seeing him not as an old man to bully, but as someone who understood their world. You're not here because you enjoy terrorizing an old diner, Harold continued. You're here because civilian life feels too quiet, too uncertain. Because here, at least, you know who you are, the tough guys, the ones in control. He smiled gently. But maybe there's a better way to find that sense of purpose again. The youngest raider, who had been silent until now, spoke up in a whisper. How did you know all that? Harold's response was simple but powerful. Because 40 years ago, I was sitting exactly where you are now, trying to figure out how to live in a world that felt too peaceful, too normal. He gestured to his usual corner booth. And right there, in that very spot, someone older and wiser than me took the time to help me find my way back. The atmosphere in Bob's diner had completely transformed. What had started as a confrontation was becoming something else entirely, a bridge being built between generations of warriors. Mike's sunglasses lay folded on the table next to Harold's compass, revealing eyes that had seen too much. The tough exterior of the Road Raiders leader crumbled as he began to share his story with the elderly veteran who had somehow broken through their defenses. 3 tours in Afghanistan, Mike said quietly, his fingers tracing the scratches on Harold's compass. Lost 4 of my best friends in an ambush near Kandahar. When I came back home, everything felt wrong. The other raiders nodded silently, each carrying similar burdens. Harold listened patiently as Mike described his struggles with PTSD, the nightmares that kept him awake, and the difficulty of adjusting to civilian life. The youngest raider, Tommy, wiped tears from his eyes as Mike explained how they had all met at a VA support group, but found it too structured, too confining. The motorcycles helped, Mike continued, gesturing toward their bikes outside. The noise, the speed, the freedom, it drowns out the memories for a while. We started riding together because we understood each other. Nobody else got it. He paused, looking around at his fellow raiders. We became each other's therapy. The other raiders began opening up too. Jack, the one with the snake tattoo, had served as a combat medic. The constant beeping of the diner's kitchen timer reminded him of hospital monitors, which explained his agitation during busy breakfast hours. Pete, the quiet one who always watched the ceiling, had been a helicopter gunner. Carlos, who checked his watch obsessively, had been a patrol leader. When we found this diner, Tommy explained, his voice barely above a whisper, it reminded us of this little cafe in Kabul where we used to get breakfast. Somehow, taking over your corner booth made us feel in control again. He looked at Harold apologetically. We never meant to become the bad guys. Susan, who had been listening nearby, quietly brought fresh coffee for everyone. This time, the raiders accepted the cups with polite thanks, their earlier hostility completely gone. The other customers in the diner had stopped pretending not to listen, moved by the stories they were hearing. Harold shared some of his own experiences, telling them about his difficult return from World War II. He described the mentors who had helped him, the strategies he had learned for dealing with trauma, and the importance of finding purpose in helping others. The raiders listened intently, recognizing their own struggles in his words. The hardest part, Mike admitted, is feeling like nobody understands. Our families try, but they can't really know what it's like. We put on these tough guy acts because it's easier than explaining why we jump at loud noises or why we can't sleep at night. The morning sun streaming through the diner's windows caught the metals on Harold's jacket, making them shine. The raiders noticed them now with new respect, understanding the weight of experience they represented. "You boys have been fighting your war twice," Harold said gently. "Once over there, and once in here." He tapped his temple. "The first one's over, but the second one doesn't have to be fought alone." Mike straightened in his seat, seeming to come to a decision. He looked around at his fellow raiders, receiving subtle nods of agreement. "We've been real idiots," he said, facing Harold. "Disrespecting a fellow veteran, causing trouble in a place that should be peaceful. We owe you an apology." The other raiders murmured their agreement, their faces showing genuine remorse. Tommy, the youngest, stood up and offered his hand to Harold. "Sir, I'm sorry for how we've acted. Could you maybe tell us more about how you got through it all?" Harold reached out and shook Tommy's hand firmly. The symbolic gesture wasn't lost on anyone in the diner. It was a moment of healing, of understanding between generations of soldiers. The morning light seemed to grow warmer, casting away the shadows of past confrontations. "Boys," Harold said, looking around at the group of veterans who had begun the morning as his tormentors and were ending it as something quite different. "I think this is the beginning of something important." He picked up his compass and held it out to Mike again. Sometimes the path home takes an unexpected turn. The transformation in Bob's diner was complete. Where there had been tension and fear, there was now understanding and hope. The road raiders had arrived as lost soldiers but were becoming something else. Men ready to find their way back to peace, guided by someone who had walked that difficult path before them. 6 months after that transformative Sunday morning, Bob's diner had become something special. The corner booth, once a source of tension, was now the heart of an extraordinary community. Every Sunday at 7:30 a.m., Harold Mitchell still arrived precisely on time, but now he was greeted by the rumble of motorcycles bringing friends rather than foes. The road raiders had undergone a remarkable transformation. Their leather jackets still bore their club name, but underneath was added a new patch: "Veterans supporting veterans." Mike, their leader, had worked with Harold to turn their weekly gatherings into informal support sessions for local veterans struggling with the return to civilian life. The corner booth became known as the Warriors' Corner. Veterans of all ages would stop by, drawn by word of mouth about the understanding and support they could find there. Harold's experience in post-war reconciliation proved invaluable as he helped bridge the gaps between different generations of soldiers. "Watch this," Susan would tell new customers, gesturing toward the booth where Harold sat surrounded by leather-clad bikers, all leaning in to hear one of his stories. The raiders, once feared, had become the diner's unofficial guardians. They helped elderly customers with their doors, entertained children with stories about their motorcycles, and made sure Harold always had a fresh cup of coffee. Tommy, the youngest raider, had made the most dramatic change. With Harold's guidance and the support of his fellow veterans, he'd enrolled in college to study counseling. He wanted to help other young veterans navigate the challenges he had faced. Every Sunday, he brought his textbooks to the diner, and Harold helped him study between conversations. Mike had stopped wearing his sunglasses indoors, his eyes now clear and focused. He worked with Harold to establish a formal mentorship program, pairing older veterans with younger ones who needed guidance. The VA hospital in town had even started referring veterans to their Sunday morning gatherings. The diner's atmosphere had been transformed. Families returned, feeling safer with the raiders' protective presence. The sound of motorcycles arriving on Sunday mornings became a welcome signal that another session of healing and fellowship was about to begin. Harold's military compass, which had helped spark the change, now sat in a small display case on the diner's wall. Underneath it was a simple plaque that read, "Sometimes the longest journey is the one back home." Veterans who visited would often stand before it, understanding its deeper meaning. One particular Sunday morning, as fall colors painted the trees outside, Harold watched his unlikely family with satisfaction. Carlos was teaching a young Marine about breathing techniques for anxiety. Jack, the former medic, was explaining PTSD triggers to a worried wife of a recently returned soldier. Pete had finally stopped watching the ceiling and was instead focused on helping another veteran fill out college application forms. "You've created something remarkable here, Bob," the diner's owner said to Harold as he refilled his coffee cup. The old veteran smiled, watching Mike demonstrate meditation techniques to a group of young veterans, something that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. "We all found our way back together," Harold replied simply. The road raiders still rode their motorcycles, but now they had a purpose beyond escaping their memories. They'd organized rides for veteran charity events, escorted military funerals, and transported veterans who needed help getting to medical appointments. Their reputation in the town had shifted from troublemakers to community heroes. Harold's Corner booth had become more than just a meeting place. It was a sanctuary where veterans could find understanding without judgment, support without conditions, and hope without pressure. The conversations that happened there helped heal wounds that no medical treatment could touch. As Harold sipped his coffee that morning, surrounded by the comfortable buzz of conversation and the smell of breakfast, he reflected on how his decision to reach out rather than withdraw had changed so many lives, including his own. The loneliness he had felt after Grace's passing had been filled by a new kind of family, one forged in understanding and mutual respect. "Hey, Harold," Mike called from across the booth, "tell these young guys about that time in Germany when you turned enemies into friends." Harold smiled and leaned forward, his eyes twinkling. The diner grew quiet as veterans young and old gathered to listen. This was how healing happened. One story, one connection, one Sunday morning at a time. The elderly veteran looked around at the faces of his new family and began to speak, his words bridging the decades between wars and warriors, turning Bob's Diner into hallowed ground where peace was found and brotherhood restored.